You already know what time it is. It's R3's time, where we read. I'm Naila. I'm your CEO and your founder of R3, Real Eyes, Real Lives, Real Lives, where we promote knowledge of self through education and activism. And what better way to do that than to read, write, and comprehend for your own overstanding. And of course, we're going to be jumping right into it. We are reading The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. You should have been on Chapter 3, which would talk about white slavery, but I'm going to pass it over to our hostess with the mostest. She's going to let you know a little bit more on the logistics, and I'll be back.
Hey, this is Howard Soda, hostess to Moses, coming at you here from R3 Book Club, where we...
Uh-oh, you're frozen. Okay, you're frozen.
Appreciate the like, shares, and following, and we want your support. And you can also go on the website and get information on our campaigns. We are a nonprofit 5013C, and you can donate for any of the campaigns, $1 up to $1 million. We take it all. Take it all, baby. But again, you can get us at R3 Real Eyes. And we are starting to pick up a following and getting a lot of more listeners and viewers, and we appreciate that. We appreciate your questions so we can answer them. So you can email us, or you can answer questions directly into the chat of any or instant message, any of the platforms I just discussed. Also today, like she said, we will be going over Chapter 3. We do have a short video from Nell Painter herself. Just a little introduction into the book and whiteness. I think it's very important to discuss all aspects, because a lot of times, especially here in America, we only consider slavery our slavery. Well, yeah, we were enslaved for 400 years here, but slavery has been a worldwide epidemic, I will call it. And the white slavery, they were enslaved for thousands of years also on those shores of Europe and other places. And this book delves into slavery for white people and the identity of whiteness as a whole, because during their slave trade, they weren't white people slavers, just like there weren't black African slavers. There were different tribes, different countries, different regions, and we're going to delve into that the further we go into this book. So I hope you enjoy. Like I said, like, share, follow for free. I don't know if Alon's there today, but we have some loyal followers. Alon and Melody are always on the book club listening. Sometimes Gina's on there, and Uncle Marcus. Well, he's not my uncle, but I call him Uncle Marcus. So, but anyway, back to you, kid. We're going to get started. We do have a 7-minute video. Like I said, I think it's 7 minutes. And that's about it. And back to you, kid.
Okay, and did you say something in the beginning? Because your phone froze and then you came back in with the social media.
Yeah, I did, but
Okay, well, if it comes back to your mind, just pop in and let us know, because you froze, but then you went right back into it. So that was great. So thank you for the introduction. Thanks for the link ahead of time as well. So yes, of course, we're going to be discussing about white slavery, and I will keep this brief so we can jump over to the video. That's about 7 minutes, she just told me. So, okay. Chapter 3, let me just open up the book and get it started. As you know, I am a connotator. So we're going to be reading on Chapter 3. And this chapter actually speaks about white slavery. For those of you who read ahead, you should have been able to get to Chapter 4, which talks about white slavery as a beauty ideal. And I'll kind of touch on that and mention it a few for Chapter 3, but we jump into it a lot in Chapter 4. So Chapter 3, and of course for the workings of this book up until first, second, and third chapter, we're speaking roughly around the 16th century and the 19th century, the colonial era, but also the transatlantic slave trade, and also the development of racism and the development of class entering into the Americas. So this is the time period we have. I have a few questions, but I'm just going to go over today. I don't want to actually read what I wrote down. I just kind of summarize it, because white people, particularly Europeans, were subjected to several forms of slavery. And this is what they're going to be talking about. The difference between that slavery and the slavery of African peoples, also known as black, to distinguish their features. And this is the concept of race, where that came into play, and having colors, whiteness and blackness, right? But the African people, and I just wanted to put in a quote there, Dr. John Henrik Clarke said, you should always attribute a people to a piece of land. So black is not necessarily a land, but Africa will be a land and a continent. So you always put a group of people with geography. So just keep that in mind when I interchange in between black and African. But while white people particularly...
I think that's what I said, if you didn't hear that. I said that the slavery wasn't white people. It was regions and different cultures, just like slavery from Africa. We always group it into black people. They weren't black. They didn't call themselves black. They were Igbo. They were Shanti. They were from wherever they were from. So that's what I was saying. Okay,
perfect. For chapter 3, while white people, particularly in poor Europeans, they were subjected to these forms of slavery, but we're going to call them involuntary servitude or indentured labor. So the difference between that and what we went through as black African Americans, right? Or black Africans, depending on where the slave ship dropped you off first, Jamaica, Brazil, it doesn't matter, but we are from the African diaspora. So depending on that, we were faced with chattel slavery. So I wanted to go over those two definitions and the differences, but the difference basically is, before I read the definitions, is that involuntary servitude and indentured labor was for a period of time. Again, it was for a period of time, and when something's a period of time, that means it shall end, right? Chattel slavery was for the length of your life. So until you expired, you was going to be someone's chattel slave, okay? And also you were it inherited into your family. So if you die, your children will inherit that status that you were as well. Chattel slavery is also referenced as property. Maybe I'll just jump into the definitions now and skip around. So indentured servitude, whites worked for a set period. Like I told you, it was temporary. It usually spanned over several years. Chattel slavery, the Africans or black people, quote unquote, are considered the legal property of others, where they are bought and sold for the lifetime. They're treated with no legal terms. They're not treated with any type of humanity. They're completely seen as property. So in this chapter, we see how there's an introduction of the political use of white slavery, and that concept is often highlighted with the exploitation of white people, but it also is drawing distinctions at this point with black African slavery. So this is in chapter 3 is where we're going to start seeing the distinctions between black African slavery and what white slavery is. I wanted to, the concept of white slavery was used politically to highlight the harsh conditions that some Europeans faced, but it was also employed to maintain and reinforce racial hierarchies over time. Racial categories were solidified, and the status of whiteness became associated with privilege and freedom, and distancing Europeans from those of the African or black enslaved populations. The distinction helped to justify those primarily targeted African black people and establish a foundation for the development of race as a social construct. And we keep talking about this being a social construct because right now a lot of people think that race is something that is technically real, but it was actually a social construct similar to that of religion, and it was used to control people, lands, geography, territories, riches, and wealth, right? And so in Western society, it was used as a social construct mainly. And thus, white slavery, it played a huge role in the social and legal creation of racial categories by drawing boundaries between white Europeans and enslaved Africans. Last chapter, we talked about some of those racial categories of white people themselves, from the Germani to the Slavs. Let's see if we can quote it really quick. To the Gauls, which the Gauls and the Germans were technically the same people, but they had distinctions in their features and the way that they lived, so they started breaking themselves down. The Romans, the Celts, are some other groups that were racially divided as well. So keep that in mind, and the hierarchies that are mentioned here in chapter 3 would be class, gender, economic, and racial hierarchies. So for chapter 3, here's some quotes on page 34. I highlighted that the first paragraph, last sentence, something we must take in consideration. A lot of time the Vikings, where we see those two horns and everybody loves talking about them, there's a lot of commercials about them. They were great movers of people, meaning they were some great enslavers. They enslaved their own hundreds and thousands, and they would move them around sparingly. So we learned about that in chapter 3, and I'll just read here. The second paragraph said, Vikings raided northern Europe and Russia hundreds of times in the 5th to the 11th century, plundering as they went and scooping up human chattel by the thousands. To sell the enslaved, a system of permanent markets evolved around settlements like Novgorod, where the Vikings warehoused and distributed the people they captured or purchased along the rivers of Don, Volga, and Dnieper, and in Bristol and in Dublin. So you hear these names, Bristol, Dublin, they're fancy places now, but no one really tells you about the historical context behind the racial categories, hierarchies that was taking place that the Vikings had that caused slavery to begin with white people, right? And then on page 35, another good highlight, anybody knows what St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day, we're always talking about that. So on 35, it referenced the second paragraph. History's most famous British slave of the early medieval period is Patrick, born Succat. It's Ireland's patron saint who provides a cogent example. Patrick's father was a local official and Christian deacon somewhere near the west coast of Roman Britain, or perhaps Gaul, in about 373 or 383 or about 456. Although much of his life remains a mystery, his saint's name, Patrick, from the patrician, emerges conspicuously. Identifying as no ordinary slave matters hugely for the 4th century. Europeans harbored unflattering stereotypes of the lowest in society. And remember, the Gauls and the Germans, they started to differentiate themselves by the looks of their skin tone, but also what they went through, dirty, mully hair, things like that, right? Also on page 35, Sambo. Where do you hear that reference Sambo come from? Okay, so it's just a reference that we always...
It's a negative reference. I know that.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, exactly. So that name comes up, and this is where stereotypes reappeared centuries later in an ocean away as Sambo, and that comes from the patron saint, Patrick. And then on page 35, second paragraph, third to last sentence, it says, the Welsh and the Celts generally were dark, had hair and skin darkened by exposure to the sun. So clearly you can see here that black was a concept that was used to differentiate the white slavery from the African, the black slavery. But at this time, they even would describe the Welsh and the Celts were generally dark because they stood out in the sun for so long, right? So I like to just add that into the context. On page 36, Anglo-Saxon, you'll probably hear me ever refer to that, Anglo-Saxon, and you can still be a black Anglo-Saxon, just a little asterisk there. But on page 36, the first paragraph, it says, the author writes, in Anglo-Saxon Britain, as elsewhere, slaves were valuable property, worth each about 8 oxen. In Ireland, a female slave represented a unit of currency, like $1 or €1. Why am I pointing that out? Because it's very, it's important that we get a figurative picture in our head when we're talking about slavery and what it was worth. It was nothing but seen as commodity. It was something seen as a currency, right? So if you didn't have money, you can sell your family in the white term of slavery, right? And you see this a lot play out in this chapter 3, especially about the Vikings selling children, mothers, kids, and then how much you can get for them. You did not have to have money. You just had to have somebody to sell. And that's when they started discovering they can enter into certain markets too without money. So on page 38, a quote, third paragraph, about the third sentence down, it says, it will not be lost on the reader that over more than a millennium, the vast story of Western slavery was primarily a white story. Geography, not race, ruled, and potential white slaves like vulnerable aliens anywhere were nearby for the taking. And then sugar made its way into the Mediterranean and on to Europe. The history begins with the New Guineans' domestication of sugar long before the Common Era and continues with its spread through Southeast Asia, China, India, and Persia. The 7th century Muslim conquest of the Middle East took sugar into the Mediterranean, inspiring the commonplace. Sugar follows the Quran. I just wanted to point that out because a lot of times people only equate African slavery, black slavery with Christianity and the Bible. But the Quran was some of the very first people, the Islam was some of the very first religions to also enslave African people. So just keep that in mind. And as over the course of the book club, as we read, we gain a further knowledge of self. So you should already know from previous books that religion was also used in order to take over people's land. It was a social construct, and it was used to it was used as a power in a social construct, period, point blank. So sugar follows the Quran, right? And then it says as well, I'll go on reading. Sugar follows the Quran as Muslims planted sugar in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Rhodes, Malta, Crete, and Cyprus. In the course of their crusades in the Eastern Mediterranean, Northern Europeans encountered this addictive substance and liked it very much. Thus began another story. Page 39, just to point out the first paragraph. In the year 1000, a linkage of sugar and colonialism began to happen. Think about sugar cane. For instance, we went down to New Orleans. We went to the Whitney Plantation, and we seen a lot of different crops that they would have to the enslaved people, African people, would have to use, and that would be like sugar cane and things like that, right? Cotton, right? So this is where we start seeing the combination of colonialism and sugar at this time, okay? And then on page 39, let's see, again, first paragraph, about the third sentence down. Yeah. After the Black Death of the mid-1300s created a labor shortage, Christian crusader kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean resorted increasingly to enslavement. Again, I wanted to point out, I said it last time, but the word Slav from the Slavic people ended up turning into the word slave. This is on page 39, the last sentence, actually. The word Slav turned into the word slave. And the author writes, faceless masses of slaves from Greece, Bulgaria, Turkey, and the Black Sea region grew sugar from Western tables until the Turkish conquest disrupted the chain of supply. Go on to read on that paragraph. Second paragraph, actually. Second to last sentence. I just wanted to point out Venice. Venice, Italy is always something that is used in great reference. Now people love vacation in there, so it's important we point out things there. But in Venice, gradually faded from the northern view, except as a romantic tourist destination and an art market. So although trade in sugar and spices and slaves as well were happening as a travel narrative, it also was taking place in Venice, and this became a huge romantic tourist destination, right? Then someone else to point out was Prince Henry the Navigator. We talked about him last book club in African Glory, him being very prominent in starting slavery. Although it says here, the author writes, Ms. Painter writes, the last paragraph on this page, he sent Portuguese sailors into the Atlantic and down the coast of West Africa, planting sugar on islands like Madeira, Sao Tome, and finding in the process Atlantic currents running from Africa to the land they discovered and named Brazil. So this is where Brazil enters in the chat. So you can see how slowly white slavery has started to move over, and we're headed across the ocean now. So out of Africa into other areas, and eventually to the discovery of the Americas, right? And bringing slavery here. And then on page 40, it goes on to say, finishing off in that paragraph, let's see. Europe's critical nexus of sugar and slavery. A similar nexus involving tobacco made Europeans, not Africans, the first unfree laborers in British America. So a lot of times people use that word slave towards black people, African people in the United States and across the diaspora as a negative connotation. But I'm one to always remind them, especially after reading this book the first time back in 2014, that they once were slaves too. So it's not to undermine our slavery, because again, there's a difference between involuntary servitude and indentured servant, and also slavery, but in chattel slavery. But they were once slaves too. So you cannot talk down to a black person when you too were put into these same predicaments. And actually, you're the beginning, the genesis of it, which caused us all to be racially divided and have hierarchies that we still face today, such as class, gender, economic, social, political, right? And so let's see, we're almost there, guys. How much time? Oh, okay, last paragraph, then I'll sum up and we'll read we lost somebody. Okay. And then we'll watch the video. She'll be back. So on page 42, it just mentions that it was a handsome business, this transport of unwilling, and it endured. Faced with an overflowing prison population, Parliament passed the Transportation Act in 1718, allowing for the removal of convicts to the North American colonies. Tens of thousands were quarreled under the act, convicts seen as scarcely human, already known as crackers, and routinely labeled scums and dregs. Benjamin Franklin, an eloquent spokesman of the colonists' loathing, proposed that in return for convicts, Americans send the mother country a like number of rattlesnakes. Between the beginning of the trade and its ending during the American Revolution, some 50,000 convicts were forcibly transported to British North America. Shortly after American independence, Britain, in need of another outlet, began shipping its convicts, some 160,000 before 1868, when the practice ceased, to Australia, continuing the process for another 90 years. In sum, before an 18th century boom in the African slave trade, between one half and two-thirds of all early white immigrants to the British colonies in the Western Hemisphere was unfree laborers, some 300,000 to 400,000 people. The 18th century created the now familiar equation that converts race to black and black to slave. And this is where we see the introduction of African people being included in this hierarchy system, this social construct. And I always tell people too, we weren't even considered at the time when race was developed. This was white people fighting over their own territories, their own people, their own lands. And another thing I want to bring up again is that the Caucasus Mountains region, anything goes. These were people with no police, with no rules, no laws, nothing. Okay, and then so I did want to just have my question. There she is. She's back. Are you there? Did I let her in? Okay, it's coming in. So let's see if I can wait a second and I'll bring up the chat. Oh, I do have some other notes. Okay, there she is. You back? Can't hear you. Can't hear you. But okay, so a few things as we wrap up. I'll pull up the video. I believe we still have time. So a few things just to leave you with is a few notes. So white slavery versus black slavery is what we have been discussing in chapter 3 and what we'll go on to discuss. White slavery versus black slavery. The white Europeans often were poor. They were indentured, while the black Africans were enslaved for life. It's a difference between permanent and temporary, just to put it in your mind. A second topic to add in there is political use of white slavery. So the concept was sometimes used to highlight the exploitation of white people, but it also drew distinctions from the Africans, the black African slavery, with the white slavery. And then the third thing to mention is racial hierarchies. Again, the idea of white slavery, it helped reinforce racial distinctions, contributing to the development of racial hierarchies. And then lastly, I wanted to leave you guys with is development of whiteness. Over time, the concept of whiteness became a privilege like we see it today. So in search of purity, in search of originality or authenticity, that they still do not technically have, it became a privilege to have this whiteness, to have this purity of whiteness. So I like that it points that out. And then a question just to leave you guys with, although I technically answered, see if we can get a response. How did the historical concept of white slavery differ from the enslavement of black African people? And what role did it play in the development of racial categories in Western society? You want to...
Well, I would say that the European slavery was not based on a race class. It was based on proximity, availability, war, and commerce. And they just happened to be next door, the Irish, the Greeks, whatever they were calling themselves at the time. It was not based on any characteristics other than we won the war and we got the right to buy you. And slavery in the Americas, per se, was solely based on race. They completely eliminated the indentured servant that came over initially, which were 20 blacks and 300 whites came over as indentured servants, to progressively bringing in, importing more slaves and making it solely black and for life. Yeah.
Correct. Hey, you've been reading. I didn't read out that quote. I skipped over it, but yes, you've been reading, and exactly that.
I don't appreciate that.
Anyways, okay, so I'm gonna try to bring I'm gonna bring up the video now. Let's see if we can do this to where you can, oh, it has it here now. Okay, so you probably will be able to see with us. Let's just share a window. We'll do the entire screen. Okay, so we're gonna watch this quick video. We have less than 10 minutes left, so we're gonna see if we can hear from the author herself. I'm just gonna zoom it in a little bit. There she is. So the text says, after so many histories of non-white people by whites, does your book seek to correct the imbalance? This is a question she'll be answering. And this is the author, Nell Irvin Painter.
It's not an attempt to correct an imbalance, but I think it may function that way. For me, it was an answering of questions. I started with a question I couldn't answer. Why are white people called Caucasian? Why? So that was where I started asking questions, and it went from one thing to another.
Okay, the next question is, where and when did the concept of whiteness originate? From the author herself.
There are two ways of talking about it. One is just to notice that there's some people who are kind of light-skinned and other people who are kind of brownish and other people who are kind of darkish. So people noticed that, immediately. But since there wasn't a lot of motion around from one's town or one's village, that didn't come up very much. So somebody like Herodotus, for instance, who did travel, he could say that, for instance, the Scythians who made quivers out of the arms, the skinned arms of the people they vanquished, that man's skin is very showy and white. So it was clear that people were light-skinned. But to make it into something called a race or variety, and then to endow that with certain characteristics, racial temperament, for instance, that latter kind of way of dealing with race, that's an invention of the Enlightenment of the 18th century.
The next question is, how did the Enlightenment era notions of race develop?
When we think of science, science is a truth that's true no matter what, no matter when, and for all time. And science, as the kind of gospel truth, replaces the gospel, which was religion. Before science, before the 18th century, religion answered the questions. And so in the 19th century, for instance, there was a real jostling between science and religion over the truth. And this is why Darwin was so controversial. But by the 19th and 20th century, science and taxonomy had created categories, all sorts of things. Carolus Linnaeus, 18th century, is the father of taxonomy, that is, of categorizing things. And so that science of categorizing things comes out of the 18th century, comes out of the Enlightenment, and counts up everything and gives it a name, including people.
Okay. We're
Not
going
so much racism, because race
to stop there really quick. Let's see how much time I have left. Yeah, my phone is dying. How was that? Was that good? Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to plug in my phone, guys, and then we're going to finish that off. It's 2 minutes left.
Yet. But the big differences were religious. So on the one hand, Catholics and Protestants. On the other hand, Christians, Jews, and Muslims. So religion was the big defining factor before race. And in fact, as we see in our own world, religion still plays a very important part. And it plays a part in a way that race does, in that you can say that somebody has a particular religion, and then that conjures up all sorts of other ideas about what's in that person, how that person thinks, how that person goes through his or her everyday life, what it means to be a man or a woman. So there's lots that we pack into these categories, whether they're racial or religious.
Perfect. All right. And then that last question that she was answering, I don't think I read it out loud, but we got the gist of it. Okay, so that was perfect. That was actually a very good video. Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing. All right, so our hostess with the Moses is going to go ahead and wrap us up before my phone dies. But remember, we are R3. We're eyes, we're lies, we're lies. You'll see me in 2 seconds. I'm going to turn it over so she can do her wrap up. Go ahead. You there?
Here, but my audio was messed up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm okay. This is How It's Sold. The host was Moses coming at you from our 3 Real Life Book Clubs, where we promote knowledge of self. And we just saw Nell Irvin Painter herself answer a few questions that are regarding the book and her processes. I hope you enjoyed that. We're here every Tuesday right now. We're at 6:30, but we will update every week. But we are here every Tuesday. So if you log on and you sign up for the on the website, you will get information and updates on as our time changes, or if we have more different campaigns. At R3 Real Lives, we get you to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and to the YouTube channel where you can like, share, and follow for free. All of those are available for you. We appreciate the like, shares, and follow. We also appreciate any donations, which you can donate at R3 Real Lives on the website. $1, $1 million, whatever you need. We are a nonprofit, and all the funds that are donated for the specific campaigns will be directly going back into the community. If you have any questions, I'm sorry.
Bless you.
If you have any questions, you can instant message us on any of the platforms, or you can email us through the website at R3 Real Lives. You can get all the information there. Hope to see you. We are reading The History of Whiteness by Nell Irvin Painter, and I hope you enjoy this. We all need to know our history and collectively on how we started and where we're going to be and where we're going, so that you can be prepared for the future. Just in case, I'm not going to get political here, but just historical fact. You just need to prepare for the future so you won't repeat yourself. That's it at R3 Real Lives. Check us out. Like, share, follow for free. Thank you, and back to you, Kid.
All right, perfect. And I'm going to just get a little bit, know your history, because history repeats itself, but we're not going back. We're moving forward. So let's know what happened so that it doesn't repeat itself again. And so we're going to go ahead and read chapters 4, White Slavery as a Beauty Ideal, for next week. And if you are brave like me, go ahead and jump over into chapter 5. Chapter 4 is quite lengthy, so do not feel the need if you can't get through it. But chapter 5 would be, come on, the White Beauty Ideal as a Science. So you guys read White Slavery as a Beauty Ideal, and then White Beauty Ideal as a Science, chapters 4 and chapters 5. I had a question on our YouTube page, and it just asked about the caucus and where it was today, I believe. And so on chapter 4, if you read from White Slavery, I'll just give you a cheat. On page 45, the author states on the third paragraph down, it starts off in the 17th century. Oh, I actually go up one sentence from that. It starts off saying, it talks about John Baptist, okay, of Chardon, and it says, preventing his going via Venice through Constantinople to Asia Minor and local disputes, rerouted Chardon north of Constantinople through the wilds of the Caucasus, which is today's Chechnya and Georgia. So if you're wondering where the Caucasus is today, it would be Chechnya. I'm probably saying that wrong. Chechnya and Georgia. And in the 17th century, this was an untamed country, according to Chardon, the lands of people, like I've said before, without a religion, without police, without rules, laws, and any type of humanity at this point. So we are R3. We're eyes, we're lives, we're lives. We read every Tuesday at 3, but at 6:30 for the time being. I will see you next week. Peace.